Hello, everyone. Today, the East Coast Economic Update will be doing a special program called The Think Tank. I think we're going to work on the name a little better, but what we've done is that Justin Faith, Doug from Goat Hollow, and myself have gotten the band back together, and we're doing like an everyman's think tank. We're thinking about big things and discussing them out loud with you for you to hear and also interact with us. Today, I want to talk about the concept of economics and economic models. It's going to be a little heady, but I think it's important to understand what I'm looking at. And based on that, of course, I know Doug will chime in, and I mean that in the nicest way. Doug will bring his perspective. I'm hoping Justin will express his. And ultimately, we're going to have an open discussion, and we want you to join us. Now, I'm also shamelessly placing here, like us on Facebook. I created a page called the East Coast Economic Update page on Facebook. I post on there more often, and Doug and I also do comments. We comment with each other as well as Dale and Justin. So if you'd like to follow along, if you'd like to post something or you'd like to comment, within reason, of course, we don't do anything that's inappropriate, but relative to the economy, please be my guest. Find me on Facebook, like the page, and join us into the conversation. So real quickly, if I can, I'm going to kind of give you a crash course in explanation of economics from an academic perspective. So everyone knows more or less the understanding of a capitalist economy or economic model. Now, we have to first understand that economics is not science. It is not a science, it's a philosophy. And the reason is because no matter what you do throughout time, economics will change and economic models will change. The perfectly good example is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, that famous book that basically coins the phrase capitalism, the movement of capital, the invisible hand that moves the markets conversation. Everything that he points out actually operates in an industrial model. Adam Smith saw the early movements of what we now know as the industrial model. And based on what he saw, which was naturally forming due to the three legs in which capitalism works, which is having a product, having the raw materials, access to the raw materials, producing a refined product from those raw materials, and somebody purchasing that product. That mechanism is unique only to the Industrial Revolution. Before that time, we can look at earlier model examples, such as, we can use the Epic of Gilgamesh. Pardon me while I just adjust my microphone, because, I want to show you that I'm not completely got my act together here today. But if we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, or in more detail, if you go and if you have a Bible in your house and you look at the first 5 books of the Bible, particularly Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, of course. Genesis is pretty much, but I digress. But the point is that model, it was the operational model of Bedouins and most countries up until the time of Adam Smith's lifetime. That agrarian model was different. Now, some people will look at that model, that what we call in Hebrew Torah, the law, the instruction model, and that instruction model seems a little socialist. Well, that doesn't necessarily is accurate. It's not a socialist model because socialism was developed out of that industrial model that we're living in right now, that 250-year model, which we assume has always been around since the beginning of time, and it is not. What we discover is, and let me just step over here for a side second here, that capitalism and communism, or socialism, works on the same premise. The premise is that raw materials are hewn from wherever it is, whether it's grain or copper or what have you, refined in an industrial complex, a factory, produced, and then sold. The mechanism difference is in capitalism says if you're smarter than the average bear, you have a right to collect more capital, and then there's a middle class, and then there's a poor class. And what happens is you collect all the money because you're smarter. You're the one that produced or created this mechanism, this factory or whatever, and everybody else goes down to the bottom. Where in communism, it says we produce these things, but money should be paid evenly. Now, I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong or one is better and one is less. I'm just saying these two operating models are based only and only on the Industrial Revolution. So what we find is before the Industrial Revolution, which I remind you is only 250 years old, almost 300 years old, but not very long. For the entire time of history of civilization, we didn't have an industrial model. We didn't even have a poverty model, and I'm going to explain. Before the invention of cities, we have Bedouins and hunter-gatherer groups. Bedouins are a much more advanced version of hunter-gatherers. They move from place to place. Now, in their idiom, their understanding, there is no understanding of the word poor, poverty, or lack of something, or whatever. You can be hungry. They have a word for that. You can be full. There's a word for that. But the concept is, as a community, as a tribe, they move from place to place with either looking for grazing land for their sheep or whatever, and they produce wool, milk, cheese, meat, and so on, and they live as a community, and they share in the bounty or they suffer from lack thereof. But for the most part, because they're always on a move, the possibility of famine is almost non-existent. So the understanding of scarcity amongst the Bedouins, which predates the industrial model, and also predates cities. So they never had a concept. There was no scarcity. They just moved to another place and just kept moving around with their goods, and they produced more people when things were good, and there were less people when things were not so great. And that flexibility allowed them to live in a world where, other than bandits and coyotes or wild animals and beasts, there was really no concerns. Once we move into a city model, and we have examples of this in the writings of the Epic of Gilgamesh, well, not just Gilgamesh, but all the writings in the stone tablets in Ur. What happens is once we move into a city and we become sedentary, within a generation, we lose the skills and knowledge of how to collect food. Plus, we stay in one location and exhaust those resources, because in those times, they really, except for the Egyptians with the flooding and so forth, and even that ended up with more salt water coming in and ruining the lands through the Nile Delta. But I digress. But once we get into a city situation and we exhaust what we have, and a number of people start to specialize out of farming and herding into artistry and making things and what have you, then there's a sudden class differential where there's scarcity. The strong, powerful person with the better weapons becomes king or what have you, and then you have workers who, prepare foods and stuff and keep the king and his warrior group, fed and prepared. Those guys live a little bit better, a little less better than the king, and then you have the masses of poverty. And there's a definite layering situation that's going on once we create cities, and you can see that happening in its present time. So you're asking me, all right, John, at what point, what's your point? The point is that this economic model of the Industrial Revolution is going to collapse. It's entropy. We're at the end part of it. Consumerism is not producing anything. In fact, we're not producing anything, not even real goods or money, just debt. So at this point, with technology automating with robots and automatons to create things, and with the development of other items that will not employ people any longer, we reach a point where that industrial model is going to collapse, and what is going to come out of it through 3D printers and technology is a non-scarcity model that has never been seen on this planet before. Now, don't get me wrong, we have had situations where there's been a big trouble transitioning to that, But ultimately, what we end up with is a new understanding. Doug would say there's going to be fire and brimstone falling from the sky, and I'm sorry I'm putting words into his mouth, but he does take a position of a more aggressive situation. I'm taking something more moderate because what I saw as a young person, seeing them develop what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, was quite a different model. There was no fire and brimstone. There was bartering, yes, but then there was a transition onto the next platform. Now, don't get me wrong, during that time, we still had the industrial model in play. But what's going to happen with nanotechnology, 3D printers, we are going to move from a 9-to-5 work situation to crowdsourcing because the necessity for us to work so we can feed, clothe, and shelter ourselves will no longer be an issue. And within a generation or two, people are going to look back at our generation and look at us and how we operated in our industrial model the way we look at people wondering how in the world they would ever use an outhouse in the middle of wintertime when you could use a toilet in your house. That kind of like, why would you do that? That's such a waste of energy and time. And that is what I believe is happening and is happening. Now, how we're going to get there by the time 2030 or 2040 happens, and that's not too far in the future, is totally up to us and totally up to the way we address the sudden radical increase in unemployment and the radical change of how we measure success or failure in this country and in basically what we understand is the industrial economic model will not tell you where we're going. So this is what we're thinking about. This is what I'm discussing with Doug and Justin, and this is where we're at. We're changing philosophies. You know, the capitalism model is not like gravity. It is not universal at all times in all places. The moment you remove and it's removed right now, we're just coming to the realization that industrial model no longer operates. And how we transition to it and how we move from that model to a crowdsourcing model where we will be doing things not for an income, not for wealth, not for power, but for the benefit of improving what we have. That mindset change is happening right now and is going to come to its fruition within another 10 years, if not less. So I leave you with those thoughts. Peace from the North Country, and I look forward to linking with Doug and Justin and Dale to give each perspective. I look forward. I encourage you, the person who's watching this, to discuss this in the comment section. Discuss it also on the Facebook page. I shamelessly am pointing out, and let us know what you're thinking. Let's have this open discussion, because as we think about this, we also change our worldview. And by changing our worldview, we, in fact, change the way we are going to address what future is going to hold. So, till next time, peace.